I'm Nima Rajan. Public health officials are asking people to avoid traveling and to celebrate the Easter weekend with their household. Chief Public Health Officer Dr. Teresa Tam says the surge in infections and the proportion of cases involving more contagious variants shows why it's important to sustain strong public health rules and individual precautions. Dr. Tam says the next few weeks may be the toughest yet, but increasing vaccine coverage has her believing that the crisis phase will be over by the fall. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is pushing back against an accusation by Ontario's Premier that the federal government's procurement of COVID-19 vaccines has been inconsistent and a joke.
Pfizer has now confirmed that they will be moving up 5 million doses from later in the summer into June. That'll bring our total from 4.6 million to 9.6 million doses for that month alone. Of course, that's in addition to the other doses of the Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccines that we'll also get.
The Prime Minister says Procurement Minister Anita Anand has done an incredible job securing vaccines to immunize Canadians against the novel coronavirus. Social distancing and masking up has not only helped stem the spread of COVID-19, but the habits also made for a non-existent 2021 flu season. Normally, by this time of year, Canada has logged an average of over 43,000 confirmed cases of influenza. But this year, the Public Health Agency of Canada says there has only been 66. There has been no evidence of flu spreading in the community, no confirmed outbreaks, and the number of hospitalizations and deaths due to the flu is zero. Canada's top military procurement official is optimistic about selecting a new fighter jet for the Canadian Air Force next year, despite challenges and delays from the pandemic. 3 fighter jet makers submitted their bids last year to provide the military with 88 new aircraft that will replace the Air Force's aging CF-18 fleet over the next decade. The Defense Department's Troy Crosby says officials are busy evaluating those bids and the additional information received. Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux says he expects federal finances to slowly become sustainable again. He says the economy is doing better than expected and that the deficit will fall over time. In a report released Wednesday, the government spending watchdog says the federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic should send the deficit to $363.4 billion. It says the deficit will drop as emergency spending measures wind down over the next 12 months. A Canadian warship was tailed by China as it sailed through sensitive waters near the country this week. The Department of National Defense says HMCS Calgary passed through the South China Sea while traveling from Brunei to Vietnam on Monday and Tuesday. A defense official speaking on condition of anonymity says China noticed the Canadian ship and shadowed it. China claims much of the sea as its territory, but many of those claims have been rejected by several international rulings. U.S. President Joe Biden is outlining a $2.3 trillion plan to re-engineer America's infrastructure over the next 8 years, saying that it will help the U.S. compete with China, create millions of jobs, and promote tax fairness without ballooning national debt. But Canadian businesses, contractors, and suppliers are asking if they will be able to take part. Experts point out the last time the U.S. imposed restrictions on foreign contractors and suppliers, it ultimately did more harm than good on both sides of the border. Halifax MP Geoff Reagan says he won't be running in the next federal election. The Member of Parliament for Halifax West says it's time to call it quits after 24 years. The Liberal and former Speaker of the House of Commons was first elected in 1993. He won 8 elections, though he was defeated in the 1997 election. The NDP is facing internal tensions over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict ahead of next week's policy convention. It has released its list of potential resolutions that could make it to the virtual floor. A half a dozen express solidarity with Palestinian causes or calls for sanctions and stronger condemnation of Israel. Dozens of NDP riding associations have endorsed one resolution that opposed a working definition of anti-Semitism set out by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. A nonprofit legal organization is praising the federal government's appointment of 2 former judges to review possible wrongful convictions. Innocence Canada calls the appointment of Justice Harry Laforme and Quebec's Juanita Westmoreland-Traore inspired. The 2 will lead consultations with many groups, including criminal law professionals and racialized communities, about the creation of the Independent Commission. A report detailing the findings and recommendations will be submitted to Justice Minister David Lametti. All right, stay with us. A Conservative MP has been called out by name and sanctioned by China for speaking out against the abuses of Uyghur minorities in the country's Xinjiang region. But that won't discourage him or his cause. We speak with Mr. Michael Chong, Foreign Affairs Critic for the Conservative Party and MP for Wellington-Halton Hills after the break. The House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee has condemned the sanctions China recently levied against Conservative MP Michael Chong and a parliamentary subcommittee. Michael Chong is a member of the Parliamentary Subcommittee on International Human Rights, which is studying abuses against Uyghur Muslims in China's Xinjiang region. Mr. Chong, the Tories' foreign affairs critic, says he has a duty to call out what he calls the genocide there and speak for the voiceless. Meanwhile, China says interference in the country's internal affairs in any form will not be tolerated. Last week, Canada joined the U.S., United Kingdom, and European Union in imposing sanctions on 4 Chinese officials who are allegedly responsible for the persecution of Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang province, a move that Beijing has called based on rumors and disinformation. Well, to talk more on these recent developments, we are joined by MP Michael Chong, Foreign Affairs Critic for the Conservative Party and MP of Wellington-Halton Hills. Welcome back to Forum Daily, sir.
Great to be here.
So what is your overall response to these sanctions by China, sir?
Well, my first response is that they will have little effect on me, as I've got no plans to travel to China in the foreseeable future. We are, of course, in the middle of a pandemic, and I have no business ties to China. That said, it's clearly an effort on part of the communist regime in Beijing to silence its critics abroad. But it won't work. We are, in fact, only going to be further emboldened to speak up about these gross violations of human rights because we know that it is effective. It's the whole reason why China is attempting to silence its critics abroad.
And in addition to supporting your resolve, what is the significance of the vote by the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee?
Well, Canada became the first parliament in the world to recognize the Uyghur genocide. It's encouraged the recognition of the genocide by other democracies. The Netherlands recently adopted a motion recognizing the genocide. It's also spurred governments onto action. As you mentioned in the opening of your broadcast, a number of countries have now come together to place sanctions on 4 Chinese officials and 1 entity for these gross human rights violations. And so we need to continue to put pressure on China. We cannot allow them to flagrantly violate international law. And under international law, Canada has not just a responsibility, it has an obligation to prevent genocide, to punish the perpetrators of genocide.
And meanwhile, we know that Canada, as you mentioned, has sanctioned these 4 Chinese officials with the U.S., United Kingdom, and European Union. What do we know so far about these particular individuals?
These are senior Communist Party officials in Xinjiang province. They are responsible for carrying out the orders of Beijing in repressing the Uyghur people. They are responsible for the construction and oversight of hundreds of detention camps where millions of Uyghurs have been incarcerated. They are responsible for overseeing programs that have implemented mass sterilization of Uyghur women through forced abortions, insertions of IUD, and other mass control birth measures. As a result, Xinjiang's birth rate amongst Uyghur women has plummeted by more than 50%. And they are responsible for a coercive state-run scheme that is forcing the Uyghur people to pick cotton and produce tomatoes.
Now, sir, as journalists, we're always looking for facts, for the truth. So what kind of evidence or further evidence do we have on the persecution of Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang province?
That's a great and very important question. There are a number of sources now that have come to this conclusion. We have satellite evidence, high definition, high resolution satellite evidence now over many years that has documented the construction of these detention camps. We have photographic and videographic evidence that have been produced by reputable news organizations like the BBC World Service, like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, that have gone in there and snuck out video and photographic evidence. And we have a number of think tanks that have come to the same conclusion. We've got academics in the United States, in Europe, in the UK that have come to that conclusion. So The evidence has been accumulating ever since 2015 when the Chinese authorities in Beijing ordered this repression to begin. And now the evidence is clear and it is overwhelming that a genocide is taking place.
All right, sir, about 30 seconds left, but how can Canadians add their voices to this effort, sir?
Well, I think they should contact their local elected members of parliament and encourage them to put pressure on the Liberal government to ban the importation of cotton and tomatoes from Xinjiang province in China. There's evidence that the Uyghur people are being forced to pick this cotton and to produce these tomatoes. There are plenty of other sources for Canada to import tomatoes and cotton from around the world, from countries that are not abusing human rights. So that's an immediate step that we as Canadians, that the Canadian government should take in order to uphold human rights and prevent the continuation of this genocide.
Health officials are urging caution as British Columbia enters a long weekend during a record-breaking COVID-19 surge. Health Minister Adrian Dix and Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry say in a news release that no one should travel outside their local community for vacation or leisure. Visitation is also opening up at long-term care homes, and they say visitors need to wear masks, stay home if they have any symptoms, and follow other safety protocols. Beginning 1 month today, electric car drivers will have to pay to power up their vehicles at fast charge stations. BC Hydro gave the thumbs up to start applying user fees after getting the okay from the BC Utilities Commission to charge anywhere from 12 to 27 cents per minute. But John Storer of the Vancouver Electric Vehicle Association warns that the rates are too low. He says that in order to encourage hotels, restaurants, and service centers along highways to install charging stations, those businesses need to get their money back through charging. Premier Jason Kenney says his government won't impose new restrictions despite a rising number of more contagious COVID-19 variant cases. The province recorded 871 new infections yesterday, nearly 300 more than a day earlier. That's the biggest day-over-day increase since mid-January. Nearly 32% of Alberta's active cases involved variants of concern, which is up from about 20% a week ago and 3% in late January. Some Indigenous groups are giving Alberta's proposed new elementary school curriculum a failing grade. Both the Métis Nation of Alberta and the Confederacy of Treaty 6 Chiefs want the curriculum to be redone, and they want a seat at that table. The Treaty Chiefs say that the curriculum is too focused on narratives from Europeans, Americans, and Christians, and that it perpetuates rather than addresses systemic racism. Some parents and educators have also loudly criticized the curriculum, with opponents arguing that there is too much religious content and not nearly enough about the LGBTQ community. The Saskatchewan Teachers Federation wants the province to move all schools to online learning for 2 weeks, following the upcoming break week due to rising numbers of COVID-19 cases. President Patrick Mays says the 2-week period would serve as a buffer to help protect students, teachers, and ultimately communities. The Federation says there were 90 outbreaks declared in schools between March 15th and the 28th. Regina City Council has voted to remove a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald from a city park. The bronze statue, dedicated in 1967, is to be placed in storage until a new home can be found for it. Mr. Macdonald was Canada's first Prime Minister, but his role in establishing colonial systems, including Indian residential schools, led to calls for its removal. Some people have suggested putting the statue in a museum, moving it behind the provincial legislature, or to the RCMP Heritage Centre. Premier Brian Pallister says his government will spend $50 million to reduce a backlog of Manitobans waiting for surgeries. But a report commissioned by Canada's doctors says it isn't enough. In October, a study conducted for the Canadian Medical Association by the consulting firm Deloitte estimated that Manitoba would need $68 million to clear its pandemic backlog of surgeries. Based on the latest modeling data, Ontario science advisors say stay-at-home orders will control the third wave of COVID-19. They say surging infections and intensive care admissions are being driven by rising rates of the more deadly variants of concern. Dr. Adelstein Brown says short-term case projections will depend entirely on the public health measures that are implemented by the government and vaccination rates. Newfoundland and Labrador's Progressive Conservative Party has a new interim leader as Ches Crosby steps down.
I announced today that I'm stepping down as leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Newfoundland and Labrador. In the interest of the PC Party and the province, I'm handing over to enable interim leader of the official opposition, David Brazel, who will carry on the fight for democracy, jobs, and growth.
Under party rules, Mr. Brazel can't run for the leadership as interim leader, and he will stay in place until a convention is held at a later date. Mr. Crosby leaves after losing his seat in the St. John's district of Windsor Lake. A group of psychologists are offering short-term therapy to people struggling to cope with this month's upcoming anniversary of the mass shooting that claimed 22 lives in northern central Nova Scotia. The Association of Psychologists of Nova Scotia says the sessions will be offered between April 5th and May 7th. Up to 3 sessions can be arranged to deal with mental wellness and ways of coping. Psychologists will offer their expertise free of charge via online video conference or by telephone. All right, don't go away. Top stories from around the world coming up after the break as the Biden administration outlines a $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan. Meanwhile, the latest targeted killing in Afghanistan has claimed the life of a policewoman, and 7 Hong Kong democracy leaders have been convicted for their involvement in protests. These stories and more coming up after the break, so stay tuned, everyone. U.S. President Joe Biden is outlining a huge $2.3 trillion plan to re-engineer the country's infrastructure over the next 8 years. He is billing it as a once-in-a-generation investment in America that will help the U.S. compete with China, create millions of jobs, and promote tax fairness. Skeptical Republican lawmakers are unlikely to embrace the plan without big changes. Much of the money would come from undoing former President Donald Trump's big corporate tax cuts. Afghan officials say attackers have gunned down a policewoman in eastern Afghanistan as she was headed to work, the latest targeted killing in the war-torn country. Provincial police said the officer was shot and wounded and later died at the hospital. 2 suspects have been arrested by police. Afghanistan has seen a nationwide spike in bombings, targeted killings, and violence on the battlefield as peace negotiators in Qatar between the Taliban and the Afghan government have stalled. After months of torture and interrogations in a Hamas prison, Gaza activist Rami Aman says he was offered an unconventional proposition: divorce your wife and you are free to go. Mr. Aman had recently signed a marriage contract with the daughter of a Hamas official, and the ruling Islamic militant group wanted to dispel any insinuation that it supported Mr. Aman's outreach to Israeli peace activists. Mr. Aman says he eventually caved into the pressure. His experience underlines the tough constraints on free expression in the Hamas-ruled territory. 7 Hong Kong pro-democracy advocates have been convicted on charges of organizing and participating in massive anti-government protests in 2019. The 7 include media tycoon Jimmy Lai, as well as Martin Lee, who is a veteran of the city's democracy movement. They were convicted of their involvement in the protest, where 1.7 million people marched in opposition to a proposed bill that would have allowed suspects to be extradited to mainland China. Niger's government says that an attempted military coup was stopped overnight at the presidential palace by security forces. The coup attempt took place just 2 days before President Mohamed Bazoum's inauguration, raising fears of more violence in the coming days. The West African country faces unprecedented attacks from Islamic extremists in the troubled region near the border with Mali. Mexico's electoral tribunal has ruled that President Obrador cannot talk about his administration's achievements during the campaign leading up to the June 6th midterm elections. The court's ruling on Wednesday places the president in a tough spot. He has held news conferences almost every weekday since he took office in late 2018. The court ruled that all government officials must avoid things that constitute political, personal, or electoral propaganda government achievements that might influence the outcome of the elections. India is accelerating its vaccination drive by opening it up for everyone above 45 years old. India's catering to domestic cases has resulted in delays of global shipments of up to 90 million doses, setting back supplies in developing countries that are reliant on Indian exports. India has exported more vaccines, about 64 million doses, than it has administered in its own population, at 62 million doses. Even though India has not officially banned any exports, officials say that there may be a need to calibrate the supply schedules from time to time. France is now Europe's largest coronavirus danger zone, but President Emmanuel Macron is resisting calls for dramatic action. The government refuses to acknowledge failure, and it blames delayed vaccine deliveries and a disobedient public for soaring infections and saturated hospitals. Mr. Macron's critics blame arrogance at the highest levels. They say France's leaders ignored warning signs and favored political and economic calculations over public health. Microsoft has won a nearly $22 billion contract to supply U.S. Army combat troops with its augmented reality headsets. The technology is based on Microsoft's HoloLens headsets, which were originally intended for the video game and entertainment industries. Microsoft's head-mounted HoloLens displays let people see imagery superimposed over the physical world in front of them, which the Pentagon says could boost soldiers' awareness of their surroundings and their ability to spot targets and dangers. Pope Francis has opened the solemn final days of Holy Week with a morning mass in St. Peter's Basilica, but he plans to skip the traditional Thursday afternoon service that commemorates Jesus' Last Supper with his apostles. Pope Francis is 84 and suffers frequent bouts of sciatica nerve pain, so he may have opted to delegate the service, given his busy liturgical schedule over the coming days that culminates with Easter Sunday Mass. All of the Vatican's Holy Week events are being celebrated before limited numbers of masked faithful to respect COVID-19 restrictions. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and be sure to visit us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You could also watch all our news and commentary on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks for joining us, and have a wonderful long weekend, everyone. Take care.